When many people examine issues like abortion, even pro-life people, they tend to think that although we can reach out to women in crisis pregnancy, although we can put forward very good arguments in the culture defending the pro-life position, we can even pass maybe some pro-life laws. But they don't think that we can actually change the culture of death. They don't think that on a broad scale we can restore human rights to the preborn because our culture, over half a century of legal abortion, has simply moved too far away from a culture of life. I want to tell you the story of a young man named William Wilberforce, who was tormented by the horrors his society was perpetrating on African slaves. In fact, he was so tormented he would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, filled with horrified dreams of what was going on slave plantations, in the bellies of slave ships, the horrifying things that were being done on the long march from African villages to the sea. He too did not think that he could do anything simply due to the fact that at that point in human history, the year 1787, slavery had been legal in every civilization for all time. And so when he met with 12 other men in a little bookshop in London, they were attempting to take on something that was almost by definition impossible and almost by definition historically unprecedented. And just like William Wilberforce and a dozen men meeting to confront a culture of death that had reigned in all civilizations stretching back thousands of years, we as the pro-life movement can meet a culture of death with a culture of life. We can transform our culture, we can restore rights to human beings, and I want to tell you how we can do that. I want to give you two reasons that I firmly believe the pro-life movement can meet this culture of death and restore human rights for preborn children. The first reason is that historically speaking, this has been done time and time again. Time and time again, small groups of passionate people confronted those injustices and rooted them out of their societies, restoring human rights to all human beings. The first movement is one I referenced earlier, and that is the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. At the time when those 12 men and William Wilberforce met in that little bookshop in London, slavery dominated the British Empire. Slavery was an essential part of their economy. It was an essential part of the plantation system in the West Indies. It was an essential part of their diplomacy with other slaveholding nations like France. And so when this small group of people decided to take on the slave trade and the slave traders, this is something that even those who shared their goals of abolition thought to be totally impossible. Men like Edmund Burke, who truly wanted Wilberforce to succeed, but genuinely felt as if getting rid of the slave trade was an impossibility. And at first, it seemed like the naysayers were right. After that meeting in 1787, William Wilberforce, the political lion, time and time again put forward pieces of legislation banning the slave trade. And time again, those pieces of legislation failed. It appeared that it was impossible to get rid of such a deeply rooted injustice in the British Empire. The Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade realized that in order to change public policy, they first had to change public opinion. And so they began to create vivid imagery of what was taking place on West Indies plantations and in the bellies of those slave ships. They realized that most British people of the time had never even seen a black person, much less a slave. And so when they heard the phrase, the slave trade, their mind did not go to the same horrors that William Wilberforce was haunted by. Instead, they thought of an abstract economic concept, something that helped the empire to function. And so in order to persuade the people that the slave trade was a moral issue, an issue of injustice that needed to be confronted, they first had to show people what was taking place. And so they began to produce vivid imagery. They created, for example, a diagram of a slave ship, the SS Brooks, an image so powerful that the abolitionists did not dare show it to certain elderly noblemen for fear they might have a stroke. This image was disseminated everywhere. They handed it out as pamphlets, as leaflets. In fact, the abolitionists would frame it and hang it in their living rooms so that when guests came over, they could show them what was taking place on the high seas, in the name of the British Empire, and perpetrated by the society that permitted it. The abolitionists also commissioned the famous designer Josiah Wedgwood, a very famous porcelain maker, to create an image that showed a black man kneeling in chains with the slogan, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This image was designed to pull the issue of the slave trade out of the realm of abstraction and illustrate to people in vivid detail that the slave trade was an actual injustice being perpetrated on actual people. This image was put on brooches, it was put on teacups and porcelain, it was even put on signet rings so that even the letters mailed out by the abolitionists would bear an image of a slave suffering on behalf of a culture that was ignoring his plight. This image began to radically shift public opinion in Great Britain. In fact, this image led to debating societies popping up discussing the issue of abolition. Suddenly, abolition went from a long-shot cause that everybody thought would fail to the issue that was on everybody's lips. These images definitively shifted public opinion away from support of the slave trade and towards support for abolition. And in 1807, only 20 years, 2 decades after that fateful meeting in a bookshop in London one rainy night in 1787, the Slave Trade Act passed both houses of British Parliament, and that injustice that was considered so prevalent and so entrenched it could never be removed from society became a thing of the past. What we see with William Wilberforce and the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade is the fundamental principles of social reform. And that is that when people see the injustice, that injustice becomes real. When they confront that injustice, they are forced to grapple with what their society is perpetrating on innocent human beings. Every single social reform movement since has always followed the principle of highlighting the injustice that is happening to the victim in order to shift the culture away from that injustice. I'll give you an example of another movement. Moving on into the 1900s with the National Child Labor Committee, we have an organization being founded in the United States of America to respond to the injustice of child labor. After the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s, there was a mass movement of people from the countryside into the cities. And virtually every major industry realized that they could make a lot of money, they could improve their bottom line by hiring cheap child labor. Children were working in factories, they were working on farms, they were working on plantations, they were working in the street trades, and these children often suffered horribly. Of course, they were denied a childhood, they were denied an opportunity to get an education, their health was often destroyed in a matter of a few years, and of course, we have seen the horrible photographs of children who were mutilated by the factory machinery. There were no safety standards back then. Children would get their hair caught in the machinery and lose parts of their scalp. They would lose fingers that were torn off in the gearing, and sometimes they even had limbs amputated. But as you can imagine, a small organization like the National Child Labor Committee lobbying the government to step in on behalf of these children, to regulate this industry, and to ensure that they were protected was not popular among enormous corporations who, incidentally, could write big checks to governments, whereas non-profit human rights organizations cannot do the same. And so what they did was they looked back at what William Wilberforce and the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade had done. And they hired a photographer, a retired high school teacher named Lewis Hine. He began to travel back and forth across the country. He would sneak into factories, he would sneak onto lumber yards to photograph the children. And these images began to land on the front pages of newspapers. They were put into magazines. They were printed into pamphlets and handed out in their thousands. They were even blown up and put on displays so that people walking past would see that the true cost of cheap goods was the blood of American children shed on the factory floor. In a handful of years, American public opinion began to shift radically on this issue because they were confronted, almost everywhere they went, with images of the children who were doing things behind closed doors but could now be seen by all. This, as you can imagine, was not a popular strategy. People don't like to see horrible images of suffering victims. But Lewis Hine responded to his critics in an address at Harvard University. And he said, "Perhaps you are sick of child labor pictures. But we propose to make you and the whole country so sick of these images that when the time for action comes, these pictures will be a record of the past." These pictures now are a record of the past, and they are a record of the past because the National Child Labor Committee and Louis Hine took these photos and showed the world what was taking place behind closed doors. Again, we see that when people are confronted with that injustice, when they are made to grapple with what is going on, what is being perpetrated by their society and helped by their silence, that culture can shift and the culture can turn against injustice. I want to tell you one more story of one more social reform movement that many of you probably think you're pretty familiar with, and that's the American Civil Rights Movement. As most of you will know, the American Civil Rights Movement was a response to the systematic injustice that was perpetrated on African Americans in the United States. African Americans, as most of you will know, were often barred from voting in the American South. There were over 1,000 lynchings. Sexual assaults were perpetrated sometimes indiscriminately, and people who perpetrated these crimes were never convicted by all-white juries. This system of injustice included even petty things, like African Americans being forced to drink at different drinking fountains, forced to use different bathrooms, forced to eat at different lunch counters. And so the movement that responded to these injustices, the Civil Rights Movement, was fighting an injustice that had been entrenched in the United States for nearly a century. Now, most people think the story goes something like this. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat, finally fed up with the injustice she had been forced to endure her entire life. That act of defiance was noticed by a young Baptist pastor named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He turned that act of defiance into a campaign called the Montgomery Bus Boycotts. The Montgomery Bus Boycotts turned into the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides turned into the 1963 March on Washington, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. declared to a crowd of hundreds of thousands that he had a vision of an America where all men were actually created equal and treated equally. So how did this happen? How did an injustice that was rooted in America for almost a century come crashing down in less than 10 years? Well, the story actually starts just a few months before Rosa Parks' famous Stand for Justice. And that was when a 14-year-old African-American boy named Emmett Till left his mother's home in Chicago to visit his cousins in Money, Mississippi. Now, what you have to understand is that the American North was desegregated. And of course, Mississippi was one of the most viciously racist states in the American South. And so Emmett Till was leaving a friendly city, and he was going to a place where an entirely different set of rules applied. And so when he arrived in Mississippi and he was hanging out with his cousins, he was bragging about his white friends. He even bragged about having a white girlfriend. And of course, his relatives couldn't believe he was telling the truth because they didn't even dare talk to a white woman, much less actually date one. And so they dared Emmett Till to actually prove that he wasn't lying. To prove that he wasn't lying, Emmett Till whistled at a white woman at a general store in Money, Mississippi. Now, historians are unclear as to exactly what happened. Some of them say the whistle was an accident due to the fact that Emmett Till had a severe stutter. But what we do know is that shortly thereafter, Emmett Till was abducted from his relative's home, and his body was found several days later at the bottom of the Tallahatchie River, wired to a 75-pound cotton gin fan. Now, when Emmett Till's corpse was discovered, the authorities of Money, Mississippi realized they had a very big problem on their hands. Because Emmett Till was not just an African American from the South that you could murder and that you could get away with. Emmett Till was from the North, and this was an enormous complication for Southern authorities. They had to send a body back to the North, and that body bore the evidence of the atrocities that had been perpetrated on this young teenage boy. So first, they came up with a good solution to this problem. They decided to bury the evidence. And in fact, Emmett Till's funeral in Money, Mississippi was already underway when orders came from Chicago authorities that Emmett Till's body be sent back to his mother, Mamie, in Chicago. And so, the Mississippi authorities came up with a second plan. They decided to seal the coffin shut, and they actually sent the coffin back to Chicago in care of the sheriff with strict orders that the coffin not be opened at all costs. This plan almost worked. But when Emmett Till's casket arrived at a Chicago funeral home, Mamie Till decided she wanted to see her son's face one last time. She asked them to open the casket, and when they refused, she told them that if they did not open the coffin, she would get a hammer and she would open that casket herself. When the coffin was opened, they finally realized the full extent of the evil that had been perpetrated on this young teenage boy. One eyeball lay partly down his cheek, his nose looked like somebody had taken a meat cleaver to it, his ribs had been kicked in, and other things too horrible to describe had been done to him. They said when the casket was first opened, you could smell his body for blocks. That is when Mamie Till made a decision that changed the course of American history. She said, "I want the whole world to see what they did to my boy." She organized an open casket funeral at the biggest downtown Chicago church that would allow her to. And in fact, when the undertaker asked if she wanted Emmett Till cleaned up a bit, she refused. She wanted people to see with their own eyes what had been done to a little boy simply for whistling at a white woman. Over 50,000 people filed past the casket and saw with their own eyes what had been done to Emmett Till. Suddenly, everybody was talking about segregation and the evils that were being perpetrated on the African American community in the South. Pastors were preaching about it, newspaper columnists were raging against it, and a photo of Emmett Till's battered face ended up in Jet magazine. Jet magazine was a magazine oriented towards African Americans. One copy of this was picked up by a woman named Rosa Parks. When she laid eyes on that photo, it was that photograph, she said, that inspired her act of defiance that would trigger a civil rights movement that would fundamentally transform the social fabric of the United States of America forever. It was one photo of one murdered boy that sparked one woman to one act of defiance that launched a movement that changed the United States and ended segregation in the Deep South. And it wasn't just the photo of Emmett Till. Photographs pouring from the front lines of the civil rights movement and landing on the front pages of newspapers were the historical catalyst for legislation that was pushed through U.S. Congress. These images shamed the public because it showed them what they had been tolerating. And these images, weighing down on the conscience of the American people, fundamentally changed their attitude towards that injustice. Those images denied them their ability to ignore what was going on. Those images demanded a response. That response came, and it was photos of what was taking place that ended the injustice of segregation in the United States. 3 social reform movements, and if I had more time, I could share many more stories with you, but all 3 stories illustrating the fundamental principle of social reform, and that is that when people see injustice, it changes the way they see that injustice. And when you change the way people see things, you change the way that they respond to those things. Injustice that is invisible inevitably becomes tolerable. We have seen this throughout history. When people do not have to face an injustice, they can ignore it and get on with their lives. But the opposite of that is also true. When people see injustice, when injustice becomes visible, it inevitably becomes intolerable. And that is what the pro-life movement today must do with abortion. We must open the casket on abortion, like Mamie Till opened the casket on the savageries of segregation. We must show the Canadian public what is happening behind closed doors, just as Louis Hine showed the American public what was going on behind closed doors. And we must introduce the victims of abortion to the Canadian public, just as William Wilberforce and the abolitionists introduced the victims of the slave trade to a British public that had remained unaware of their plight and unaware of their fate. Together, we can do this. When we confront the injustice of abortion, we are walking in the footsteps of great social reformers, and we are using strategies that are tried and true. They have worked in the case of slavery. They have worked in the case of child labor. They have worked in the case of segregation. These were deeply rooted injustices, and yet, when the victims were shown to the public, everything changed. We can do that here too with the victims of abortion. So you might say, okay, historically speaking, injustices have been confronted, injustices have been eradicated, but we live in a different time. Do those tactics still work today? And the answer to that is an emphatic yes. I have been privileged to personally see hundreds of people change their mind on the abortion issue after seeing a photograph of an abortion victim. In fact, I talked to one young man on a university campus, and he not only changed his mind, but he brought all of his friends over to the display to look at the images of abortion victims, and most of them changed their mind as well. Over 15 people in the span of just a few hours. Another one of my friends on the same campus was talking to a young woman. She changed her mind about abortion during the course of a 20-minute conversation. And when he gave her some pamphlets before she left the conversation, he said, "Maybe you know somebody who could use this information." And she said, "I do. My dad is an abortionist." You never know who you are going to reach when you show the truth about what abortion is in the public square. And it's not just my stories. Young people right across Canada confronting the Canadian public with the truth about what happens behind closed doors get to see time and time again people leave the culture of death, embrace a culture of life, go from pro-choice to pro-life. These are just a few of those stories.
While doing Choice Chain, I was holding an image of an 11-week-old aborted child. Two boys walked up to me and they said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "This is what an abortion looks like." I then asked them if they believed in human rights, and they said, "Of course we do." And after talking about human rights for a bit, they both agreed that an abortion is a human rights violation because it kills a child, and they walked away completely pro-life.
I was doing Choice Chain at the high school in Calgary, and in the span of a lunch hour, I literally spoke to 35 students who had never thought about the issue of abortion before. And by the end of my conversations with them, every single one of them realized that abortion was a human rights violation.
While doing Choice Chain in downtown Windsor, I spoke to a woman named Christine, who shared with me that she thought abortion was wrong in all cases except for sexual assault. And she then mentioned how she just left the courthouse where she was dealing with her own sexual assault case, and she wasn't sure if she was pregnant or not. So Christine wanted to know, what did I think about that? I told Christine how valuable her life is and how we as a society need to do more to care for women like her who have been through such a traumatizing experience. I then showed her how valuable the life of the preborn child was as well, and that they are deserving of their human rights. Christine smiled at me and said, "Wow, you really struck a chord in me." We shook hands and she went on her way.
Not knowing that Hannah had already spoke to her, I asked her again what she thought about abortion. While motioning across the street, she said, "Hannah changed my mind," and she went on her way.
While doing activism, I asked a woman walking by what she thought about abortion. She then pointed to a cute little boy in her stroller. She told me that she was going to get an abortion, but chose not to after seeing our signs and talking with us. Little Noah is alive today because his mother saw what abortion really does to preborn children.
I was recently doing activism in downtown Hamilton when a young woman approached me and said, "I saw you guys here last week and I was going to get an abortion, but after seeing the pictures of aborted children, I changed my mind. I'm keeping my child."
As you can see from these testimonies, hearts are being changed, minds are being changed, and lives are being saved on Canadian campuses, on Canadian streets, every single day. We've been privileged to see children rescued from abortion. We've been privileged to see that the horrible truth about what abortion actually is has the capacity to change people's minds and save other preborn children from a similar fate. But you might say, okay, so when you're out in the streets, when you're having conversations, some people might change their minds. But do those stories actually form data points on a trend going towards pro-life? We might be able to change individual minds and save individual lives, but do these tactics work the same way they did for the abolitionists and for the child labor activists or for the civil rights activists? Are they actually contributing to a shift in the culture that is meaningful enough to give us hope for a pro-life future? The answer to that is an emphatic yes. The Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform has actually commissioned pollsters to take a look at how people respond to images of abortion victims. These questions specifically asked those who saw these images whether or not those images contributed to shifting them towards the pro-life position. What we found was that 66.9% of people who see an image of an aborted baby shift towards the pro-life position as a result. What does this tell us? This tells us that all those stories that you just heard are data points. They are data points that are leading us towards a pro-life future here in Canada. This shows us that a pro-life society in Canada is not only possible, every single day we are shifting closer to that goal. Every single day people are seeing the truth, that truth is waking them up, and that truth is setting them free. Let's go back for a moment to where we started, with William Wilberforce. When William Wilberforce began his crusade against the slave trade and later against slavery itself, everybody thought his cause was hopeless. At many points in his life, William Wilberforce himself thought that his cause was hopeless. As we mentioned before, images of what was taking place haunted him. The reality of what was taking place in his country haunted him. And yet, in 1833, just a few days before William Wilberforce passed away, he got to hear the news that slavery itself had been abolished across the British Empire. A small group of abolitionists had accomplished the impossible. He spent his whole life in defense of human rights. In fact, he had nervous breakdowns. He worked so hard to reveal to the public what was going on. But after 2 decades, he saw the slave trade abolished, and in a few decades more, he saw slavery itself abolished from the greatest and most powerful empire on earth at that time. This tells us that we too can achieve the same thing. If we look back at William Wilberforce, at Lewis Hine, at the Civil Rights Movement, and we learn from their strategies, we learn the principles of social reform, we see that not only can injustices be abolished in the past, injustices can be abolished in the present. We hope that you can see these things, you can hear these stories, and that you too can take hope that there is a pro-life future for Canada, and we want you to be part of that future. Yeah, good. Testify.